My name's Philip. I'm the Manager of Strategy and Economic Development at Council. So strategic planning, including our heritage planning, sits in our part of Council. But I'm going to open up, first of all, with acknowledgement of country. Central Goldfields Shire Council acknowledges and extends appreciation for the Dja Dja Wurrung people, the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on today. We pay our respects to leaders and elders past, present and emerging. They hold the memories, traditions, the culture and the hopes of all Dja Dja Wurrung people. We express our gratitude in the sharing of this land, our sorrow for the personal, spiritual and cultural costs of that sharing, and I hope that we may walk forward together in harmony and in the spirit of healing. I'm going to hand over to Councillor Jeff Lovett now. He's been very much part of this project from the beginning, and welcome from Council.
Thank you very much, Philip. For those of you who don't know, I'm Jeff Lovett, a councillor for Central Goldfields Shire. First of all, let me welcome you all here. It's a pleasure to see so many people here because this is a very important part of Council's activity and the heritage overlay affects everybody. So it's good to see so many people here. Tonight is an opportunity to hear where our review of the Maryborough Heritage Overlay is, and there will be an opportunity for everybody here to interact with the Shire planning people, the people from Extent, and to ask some questions that you may have. So it's very important that we get all views before the final heritage overlay is accepted by Council. Now, Council play a very important role through the planning scheme in protecting what I consider to be our magnificent heritage buildings here in Maryborough. And this heritage overlay that we're looking at is for Maryborough, not for Central Goldfields Shire. And the buildings that we cover are both public and private, so everybody is covered by it. It's important, I think, that we protect the buildings that past generations have left for us so that future generations can see where they've come from and what their roots are and can enjoy the buildings. But at the same time, Council are very conscious that as well as protecting buildings, that we don't stifle progress. So there is a balance between the two. I think it's probably fair to say that some of you are here tonight because you are fearful that your homes are under threat and you can't do what you want to do, but you may be controlled. This is not the aim of the heritage overlay, but there must be a balance between protection and progress. It just can't be open slather. The current heritage overlay covers large portions of Maryborough, great slabs of Maryborough. A previous heritage overlay took what's called a shotgun attitude, and there are whole blocks covered by a heritage overlay, when in reality, there may be 1, 2, or even half a dozen buildings that really need protection. But because of this shotgun way it was done, whole slabs of Maryborough are covered. This new proposal will see it replaced by a number of smaller but far more focused, far more targeted precincts. So the heritage overlay, as it stands for Maryborough, if this is passed, will be replaced by about 8 new precincts, but those new precincts will be far more targeted. If adopted, it will help us protect what's important whilst not unduly restricting what you do with your property. A lot of work has been done by Extent and the Community Reference Group. And I would like to thank the people who were involved in the Community Reference Group. they were members of the public, council staff and councillors. But there has been a lot of work put in by the community reference group, and I know Extent have found them to be extremely helpful. So I would like to thank them. I was actually involved in the very first heritage overlay done for Maryborough back in 1992. And I have to say, that was where this shotgun scatter come from. The work Extent has done and continue to do, and tonight will be a very important part of that. Michelle will listen to all the comments and all your views will be put into the final report. The work Extent has done, I believe, has been the most impressive, the most comprehensive of the 3 heritage overlays I've been involved in. Extent have been fantastic in getting to know Maryborough, but also getting to listen to our community and what's important. The review was funded by the state government under their regional partnerships program. Some of you may be surprised when you see the new suggested precincts. Some areas of Maryborough are not included and will not be included in our new heritage overlay. The reason for that is the funding agreement that we had with the state government is that we can only look at the previous heritage overlay, which was H0206. So, for example, I was very concerned that Isabella Wharton Place is not included in the will not be included in the new heritage overlay. The reason for that, as I found out quite simply, was that top end of Dundas Road was not part of H0206. There are great slabs of East Maryborough that aren't included because the old H206 only included P&N, the flour mills, and a couple of streets beyond on the east side of Railway Street. However, I will say that in the future, the areas that have been not included in this will be looked at in the future. Tonight, Extent and the council planning people will take you through the project, will explain what the process has been and what the process will be from here. As I say, it's very important that we get your thoughts, we get your feelings. So if you've got something, if you disagree with things, say so. This is the opportunity. But the new heritage overlay planning scheme will be a vast improvement on the one we're operating under today. And I believe it will benefit not only the residents, but will also benefit council in making their planning decisions. So, Philip, it's all yours.
Thanks, Councillor Lovett. Just a few housekeeping things first, so you know how the evening will proceed. I'm going to spend a few minutes, about 10 minutes, just explaining the background of the study and how we got to where we are now and where it sits in council's overall planning program. Then I'll hand to Michelle, who'll go through the study itself in a bit more detail. She's got a presentation with including some of the maps and things on there to take you through that, and that will essentially be the first half of the session. And at that point, we'll be able to break. We'll be able to grab a cuppa or a snack anytime, but we'll break there and then move upstairs, or there's a lift there if people need that. But upstairs, we've got tables set up with some of the detailed precinct maps and so on, where you'll be able to gather around tables in smaller groups and talk one-on-one or in a small group with individual officers or from Extent. And we'll take questions then rather than here, because a lot of the questions will be quite specific about individual precincts and properties and so on, and we wouldn't get through very many of them with the whole group here in just one person at a time. We could do it in smaller groups upstairs. So a couple of housekeeping things. If you don't know this building, there's toilets just through here. You can go out that door around. There's also toilets upstairs when we're up there, and there's copies here to grab any time. One other thing to point out is we are recording this session this evening, and that's so that we can put this information up on the web for anybody who couldn't make it tonight to access that online. So coming back to council's role in heritage, heritage in many ways is tiered so that there are places of national heritage significance. There are places that are recorded by Heritage Victoria that are listed as of state significance. And at a council level, our role is to look after heritage of local significance. So some things will be both. They'll be in a council planning scheme heritage overlay, but they'll also be on the Victorian Heritage Register, and the station building just out here is one of those. So the state ones have to be a very significant level to be on that list, but we look after other heritage that is deemed of local significance. And our tool for that is in the planning scheme, the Central Goldfields planning scheme, and by using the heritage overlay as a tool to identify areas that are significant and need, in order to be protected, need some planning controls. You get a planning permit if you want to do certain things on the property so that the heritage values can be assessed and looked after. We operate within the Planning Environment Act, and the overarching intent of that with the heritage overlay is to conserve and enhance buildings, areas and other places which are of scientific, aesthetic, architectural or historical interest or otherwise of special cultural value. Cover quite a range of things. We often think of it as just historic buildings, but it can be broader than that. And they've to put that level of protection with the overlay, they need to meet certain criteria. They're actually very specific requirements in the planning scheme and the practice notes that are set by the state government, right? Being able to identify what is of significance and what level is that significance. And you have to be able to say, what is significant? How is it significant? Why is it significant? And how does it compare with other like things? So if there's a street of intact buildings from a particular era, are there similar streets and streetscapes like that in other towns, or is this unique to a Maryborough, for example? What sort of status does it have? And that can help determine just how important it is to protect. I had one heritage advisor, previous council I worked on, who said, you need to keep in mind that not everything that is old and quaint is of heritage value in terms of should be protected by the heritage overlay. And Michelle's work, and people who are heritage experts like that, we don't have the expertise in council to do that work. It's very detailed and very, it requires sort of technical knowledge and is measured against the criteria. Michelle will talk about some of that. We don't want to get too technical this evening, but it helps to understand what the process is. The council had a record, a study that was done in 2005 that was reviewing heritage in the Shire, and it looked at various parts of the background to that. So prior to amalgamation of counties in the 90s, there were different studies in the different shires that came together in the city of Maryborough to form Central Goldfields Shire. And some of those have been implemented in more depth than others in terms of actually applying the heritage overlay in the scheme of places that were recommended. It also looked at how things have been done in the past. One of the key things it said that was also picked up in our residential strategy work of 2020 is that overlay is probably more extensive than it should be because it's picked up lots of places that aren't particularly of heritage significance. There are two problems with that. One is there are people who own properties in that overlay that there's no particular value in my house or in my street, and yet I've got a heritage overlay on my place, and it means I've got to get a planning permit, and there are all sorts of things that are applied to that that maybe shouldn't apply for that particular street or that particular property. And that generates more permits than we should have and creates problems for both property owners and council with permits that really shouldn't be required if the heritage overlay has been applied inappropriately. Second problem it causes is because it's so widespread, it's not specific enough for the places that really are important. So there's not enough detail in what we've currently got in the scheme to say which particular sites or which particular streetscapes are important and what it is about them that is important. So sometimes we'll then get an application, and our stat planners, and I'll introduce Peter later on from our statutory planning team, they handle permits, and it's very hard to make a decision to advise a property owner, oh, you should be able to do this but not this, because the information isn't clear enough to provide guidance for somebody who owns a property. What can I do? What do I need to look after and what don't I? And for decision makers to make a decision. So we've seen a few things where places have been lost and a permit's been allowed to demolish or drastically alter a place. And we say, well, perhaps that only happened because we didn't have clear enough guidance in the scheme to say that was important and why it was important. So we're picking up that recommendation from 2005. Take a long time to get here because these things are large pieces of work and council needs to find the resources to do them. And in this case, we've had the external funding to do it. As Councillor Jeff said, it's targeted on a review of that HO 206, which is the large one covering much of Maryborough. We've got other heritage work to do, but we can't do it all in one hit. So if people want to tell us, oh, there are other things we should be looking at, we're happy to note those for future work, but we can't do everything in this one project. So the review, the brief for this review really was to look at those 8 recommended smaller precincts from that 2005 study and to interrogate that and say, are they in the right place? Have they captured the right geography in terms of which areas they're covering, and is the mapping of the boundaries right? Have things changed since 2005? Have some properties gone that were there at the time? Looking at under current criteria, what's in, what's out. So that was stage 1, and the community reference group was really pivotal in giving feedback, because what we've got are council planners to understand the planning scheme. We've got heritage experts, but we need the local knowledge to tell us what should be and what does the community value. What might we have missed, because we've got more eyes there with people with real passion for local heritage who've been able to say, oh, have you looked at that? Why isn't this place in there? Why is that place in there when maybe it shouldn't be? And so we've had this process over several months and several meetings with that group to look at those precincts. The boundaries have been modified a little bit based on that feedback, and also to say, well, what do we lose if we apply these 8 smaller precincts and we take off the big one that's over a much larger area? How do we make sure we're not losing things that are important, and what might have been missed in the past? And out of that, Michelle will take you through that, we're able to identify a couple of other kind of precincts, but more like group listings, which are more like a thematic thing, not necessarily all in one space, but a cluster of industrial heritage sites and a cluster of dealing with the railway heritage. And they might be in different places, but they're connected by a theme. And then we ended up with 8 other individual properties that we said, well, what else should be protected just because it might be of individual significance, even if it's not in a precinct where the whole street or a whole block is of heritage value. So that work of the reference group was really pivotal in identifying what you see in the report. Now, I presume most of you are here because you've got direct mail. I mean, we've advertised as well, so anybody who's interested in heritage might be here, but also we've direct mailed anybody whose property is in the current precinct with that information. And there's got information sheet, information about how you can apart from get information like tonight, and a one-on-one chat tomorrow if you book for that. I think there might still be a few spots available if you haven't got a one-on-one time slot, and Laura at the front desk can take your name and see if we can fit you in with that, or follow up outside of that if you want that personal information and chance to ask questions that if you don't get them answered tonight. So we're genuinely wanting to get as much feedback from people to say, look, have we got it right? Have you had a look at the information about your precinct or your property? Is there stuff we've missed? Because you know some of the history that we don't, that should be included in there. If you think we've got the whole project wrong, you can let us know about that as well, or give us your feedback, and then that will come back to Michelle at the next stage to review the and you've probably seen the information. There's lots in there. There's 3 volumes, and one of them, when you print it, it's got to be broken into 2. So we couldn't print hundreds of copies of this to distribute, but it's all there online for, if you haven't seen already, at the front desk at council, at customer service, or up at the library. If you want a hard copy to sit down and look through, you don't need to get your head around every word in the documents, because a lot of it is quite repetitive. And when you get to the citations, the 2 bits of volume 2, some of that historical information is repeated because it's general stuff about Maryborough, and you probably just may individually want to drill down to just what's there about your precinct and don't need to read. But if you love all that detail, you're welcome to try and get across. But we're aware it's fairly technical, and tonight is about maybe answering the very sort of basic questions of, well, how does this affect me, my property? So I thought we'd do upstairs, second part. I'll probably just wind up there and over to Michelle. Their work has been very extensive, as you appreciate. We're trying to make that as brief and as accessible as we can for a session this evening. But as we've said, if you want to unpack the stuff about your particular area, two opportunities for that are upstairs the rest of the evening, or booking a session one-on-one if you're coming tomorrow, or outside of that, Roger here from our Roger, our strategic planner, is coordinating feedback and responses, so you can get in touch with Roger and myself via council. Customer service, give us a call, and we'll try and make some time to answer any questions you've got. I'll hand over to Michelle now, and she'll take you through. Do you need any help with that?
All right.
And if you're having trouble hearing from the back, we do have a microphone,
Yeah.
but it's probably easier to talk without it. But put your hand up if you really want us to use that.
You would like me to use my microphone? Hopefully this is on. Is that better? Is that working? No. Yeah. Is that better? Is that working up the back? Yep. Okay. As Philip said, I'm Michelle. I work for Extent Heritage. I've got a bit of a presentation here to run through with the background of the work that we've done today around Maryborough. So kind of give you a bit of a background of who Extent and I am, just to start with, just to situate yourselves and understand what we do as a practice. Also a bit of background on generally how kind of the best practice methodologies around heritage reviews. This isn't something we just came out with out of nowhere to apply to Maryborough. There is a kind of a process that's undertaken throughout Victoria when heritage reviews are undertaken. And then a bit of a background on the methodology for this particular study, how we've gotten to the recommendations that you see in front of you now. A lot of that information is in reports, but as Philip said, they're quite wordy. I understand it's very technical language, so I'll try and make it as kind of straightforward as possible for you tonight. And then also just to touch on some of the key recommendations that we've made around particularly those precincts that we've revised, but also touching on some of those individual places. As Philip mentioned, we've selected kind of the places that we think are of particular importance within Maryborough that weren't falling within those precincts, but still definitely needed to be protected. And they've been given what's called an individual heritage overlay as opposed to a precinct overlay. I am a technical expert, so I might use terminology that I think is straightforward, but isn't straightforward for you. So if you're struggling to kind of understand some of the words I'm using, I will be upstairs later and you can come and ask me and say, I didn't understand when you used that acronym. Can you please explain it to me? I'm more than happy to do that. As I said, I'm the technical expert. Sometimes things are straightforward to me. I forget general knowledge. So I'll try and be as open as possible and kind of explain some of the thinking behind our technical application of the heritage overlay. But if it's kind of going over your head, or if you're just not understanding how I'm talking about it, more than happy to try and explain how we've gotten there. In terms of the actual Maryborough on the ground stuff, you probably all know it better than me anyway, because you live here. So very, very happy to hear the thoughts about your properties and your precincts and the places that you're affected with, and anything that you can give us to further strengthen the documentation that we've already prepared today. So just as I said, quick introductions. So I work for a company called Extent Heritage. We're Australia's largest heritage specialist consulting service. We've got offices in Melbourne, Brisbane and Sydney, as well as doing work in Tasmania, the ACT and South Australia. I particularly work in what's called the Heritage Places team. So we've got also specialist archaeologists on staff and a few other specialities, but we predominantly work with the built environment. So that will be places subject to local heritage protection, state heritage protection, national, and also world heritage when those opportunities arise as well. In particular, in the Melbourne team, which I'm part of, we've undertaken a number of heritage studies across the state just in the last couple of years particularly, and we've also been engaged on the Victorian Goldfields World Heritage bid, which I can't talk about in detail, but just to give you a sense of, we are working really actively in the goldfield space at the moment as an organisation. We have pretty significant technical knowledge about what's happening around that World Heritage bid for the goldfields as well. Just a quick CV for me, just so you understand who I am and where I'm coming from. So as I said, I work in the Melbourne office. I'm an associate within that team, and I have been working in the heritage space for nearly a decade. I've worked in kind of the whole range of heritage processes, from working with proponents to seek heritage approvals for works to their houses or to their heritage sites, working through planning permits, Heritage Victoria permits, across the range of things. I provide statutory heritage advice to a number of councils within Melbourne and within the broader metropolitan region, including cities of Boroondara, Yarra and Darebin. So that means I basically, when a permit application comes through the door, the planner will send it to me for expert technical comment. So in addition to that, I've also taken part in a number of heritage studies as contributor, but also as a project lead, including being the project manager for the Maryborough review. So just a bit of background on who I am. And then this is probably repeating some of what Philip said, so I won't go into it in too much detail, but effectively Extent were engaged by the Central Goldfields Shire in association with the State Department to undertake this review of HO 206. We were provided with the brief. We created a methodology that was responsive to that brief and looked at particularly the recommendations of the 2005 Heritage Review. Sorry, there's a really cute baby out here. It just keeps distracting me. It's very sweet. I'm like, oh, she's putting on her little entertainment over there. It's probably much more interesting than me. But yes, that's basically where we came to, is that we were given a brief to look particularly at the borders and boundaries of HO 206 and the recommendations of the 2005 report to see whether they were still valid and still effectively captured the important heritage considerations which apply to Central Maryborough. So before I kind of go into the findings of that project that we worked on, I just wanted to touch briefly on how we undertake heritage studies as an organisation, but broadly as a profession, being heritage consultants generally. We have a number of kind of best practice guidelines and documents that we work under. The overarching one of which is called the Borough Charter. If you've ever done anything in the heritage space, you may have heard of this. It was an Australian document signed in 1979, and it basically forms the framework for the assessment of heritage, both in Australia, but is actually used worldwide. And it's quite a foundational document for how we think about heritage protection Australia-wide, but particularly in Victoria. It sets the basis for what we call significance. And you'll hear me use this word quite a lot. You'll see it in a lot of the documents that are in front of you, where you have this statement of significance: how, why, what is significant. The Borough Charter is the thing that sets that assessment guideline up. And everything that all the current legislation we have in Victoria and Australia really stems from that original charter. And that includes the planning practice note, which is the thing that we really need to think about as consultants who are applying the heritage overlay. There is a practice note prepared by the state government that says this is how you assess local heritage and you apply the heritage overlay. So all the decisions that I'm making or my team is making is under the guidance of that planning practice note. And that's the expectation of the state government and of planning panels when they're making decisions about whether or not these type of things should be inscribed in planning schemes. They are making sure that the work we do is in accordance with that practice note. So in particular, the practice note establishes a number of criteria which need to be applied you need to demonstrate that the place you're looking at meets at least one of these criteria. Doesn't need to meet more than one. If you meet one, you satisfy the requirements for a heritage overlay to be applied to that particular place. And you might notice that I use the word place a lot as opposed to building. That is to be encompassing of what heritage protection is. We don't just protect buildings, we protect streetscapes, we protect gardens, we protect landscapes. We don't just protect buildings. So while most of the places that are subject to this review are buildings, we are protecting more than that. And so the terminology that I tend to use is heritage place rather than heritage building. I'm not going to go through these criteria in detail, but just so you are aware, this is what we're looking at when we're assessing whether or not something has a level of significance worthy of being protected under a local heritage control. The other thing that the planning practice note guides us in is the format and content of the documentation that supports the heritage overlay. So the current documentation that supports HO206 does not meet this current guideline and this current guidance. It would not, if you just took the existing work that had been done today and put that in front of the state government and said, please approve this, please let us change our heritage overlay in accordance with the 2005 review, it wouldn't get passed because it doesn't meet this framework that has been set up by the state government to make sure that heritage controls across the state are consistent, while responsive to local places as well, still making sure that they're legible and understood through this framework of what, how, and why is it significant. So when you see the citations in that volume that Philip picked up, you will see that we've got statements of significance for all of these new precincts, all of these new individual places that follow that format and explain what is important in these areas and how they're significant and why they are significant. Those statements of significance are supported by detailed analysis, both historical, descriptive information, comparative analysis that supports that assessment of why that place is significant. The other thing to note is that for the precincts in particular, each individual place within that precinct, and then the majority of times they are buildings, is given a grading or a designation. So basically you can understand the level of importance or contribution that that particular place makes to the overall significance of the precinct. The definitions that we've applied to the Maryborough Heritage Review are here. I'm not going to read them out. They're in the report, but effectively it's significant, contributory, and not contributory. I would say 90% of the places that we have in these precincts are contributory. They are important to that precinct and contributing to the overall understanding of the importance of that streetscape or that area, and that they're making a contribution. When something is considered to be significant, it's basically saying it's got the same level of importance as an individual building outside of that precinct. So it's quite a high bar and quite a high threshold to be considered to be significant. Buildings that are not contributory are basically buildings that are within your heritage streetscape, but not actually heritage buildings or heritage places. So it might be modern development that's occurred subsequently. It's considered to be not contributory, and the controls, the heritage overlay would still apply to that place, but the considerations which apply to the management of that place would be different. All the precincts in the Volume 2 report have grading maps and grading schedules attached to them. So you should be able to understand your particular property, what that grading looks like, and then these are the definitions that kind of apply when looking at that, if that makes sense. So in terms of the Maryborough Heritage Review specifically, just wanted to quickly go through the methodology that we've applied in developing the recommendations that you see before you today. So Extent Heritage, as I said, were engaged late 2022, the second half of 2022. So we've been doing this project for over a year now. We undertook our first kind of phase of field work, I think November, December last year, and did have a town hall meeting then. I think some of you might have been there. I wasn't myself, my colleagues did that one. But as part of that kind of initial phase of review, we looked back at the previous work that had been done. So both the 92 study and the 2005 study looked at the recommendations of both of those reports and grappled with whether or not they were still valid. We also undertook quite a lot of consultation with the Heritage Reference Group, the community reference group, who kind of put their hand up to be involved with the project going forward. And as Philip and Jeff have both said, their contribution was really invaluable in us developing the precincts you see in front of you today. I want to note that the precincts that we have now are expanded versions of what the 2005 report recommended. We have kind of gone a little bit further than their initial recommendations because we thought that they weren't quite kind of capturing enough, or that were places that were of importance that weren't being protected in those original heritage precincts. And the Heritage Reference Group are really important in guiding what those boundaries look like and where those places that had been missed were. So just to clarify that. And then that basically turned into what we've called the Stage 1 report. It's in the documentation that's online. It's an appendix to the Volume 1. So you can kind of go back and see where we got to as part of that Stage 1 reporting. And then that led into the main Stage 2 report, which is the preparation of those statements of significance and citations, which will become the basis for the revised planning scheme controls. In addition to the actual citations and statements of significance, Accent's also prepared a couple of guideline documents that will help in the management of the revised heritage overlay. So that includes the Maryborough Heritage Design Guidelines, which have become the Central Goldfields Heritage Design Guidelines. It's a little bit of a typo there, sorry. I'll explain a little bit more in a minute, as well as the Heritage Overlay Exemption Guidelines. And I've got a section in the report where I kind of detail exactly what they are doing, but effectively they are management tools to help both council and residents understand what can and can't be done to their heritage places. So with regards to the kind of key findings of the review, as I said, the 2005 review, the precincts that were established as part of that review have formed the basis of the documentation that's here today, but we have expanded them and we're quite supportive of the kind of principles underlying those particular precincts. There are a number of residential precincts that we picked up kind of dotted around the HO206 area, as well as the civic and commercial centres being kind of managed in their own heritage overlays that captured those particular histories and those particular characters. There were, as I said, a few places that were of importance that fell outside of those precincts that we thought still needed to be protected. So we proceeded with preparing individual heritage overlay citations for those particular places. I've got a list of them in here. They're in the report. I'll go to them in a minute. Kind of already gone over this, but effectively we ended up with, no, it was originally 8. We ended up with 9 precincts when you count some of the changes that we made, 2 groups/serial listings and 7 individual places. So this is the map that you've probably seen. It was in the documentation that was mailed out to you. I know it's really complicated, so I can go through it in a little bit of detail, and I'm happy to kind of stand around upstairs and kind of talk to bits and pieces of it. But effectively what you see is the external red outline is the existing HO206 boundary. So that's currently what's protected. And we're not proposing to add anything to the heritage overlay as part of this project. If you're in a precinct, you already have a heritage overlay on your house. We're just changing the kind of management tool that informs the management of that particular place. But what we are doing is refining the heritage overlay into these smaller, tighter, more specific precincts. It looks like there's a lot of blank space on the map where we're not applying a heritage overlay, but we can go through it in detail. But where the heritage overlay is being kind of removed or deleted, it's where those particular places don't meet those criteria at the level that supports the heritage overlay at a local level, as I just kind of stepped through. So they don't meet one of those 8 criteria at a local level when compared to similar places. So you can see we've got kind of those large coloured kind of blobs, very technical term there, are the kind of large residential, commercial and civic precincts. And there's also the individual precincts are in a number of different kind of hatched colours. as I said, I'll be upstairs afterwards and I can talk to specific details both on this map and on the precinct maps. So these are the precinct maps in detail, and I'm not going to go through one by one exactly which properties are included and why they're in this precinct and not in another precinct, or why something on the edge was kept in or out. But we did look at all the properties really carefully. We recorded every single property within the existing heritage overlay area, both like in person. We came to Maryborough, did a lot of field work here, and then looked at them all back in the office in detail with the data that we'd collected, and made certain decisions about where these lines should be drawn. So this is Civic Square precinct. That's picking up that civic centre of Maryborough, the post office, the town hall, the hospital, that kind of central area. The commercial area is pretty self-explanatory, but yeah, picking up High Street and not the Nolan Street spine, including a number of contributory, non-contributory properties in that area, but really speaking to the commercial development of Maryborough, both during the gold rush, but in the kind of post 20th century era and interwar era as well. The former jail precinct, which is focused up on Barclay Street on the former jail area. This is a particularly lovely little precinct that I'm quite fond of. It's all, you probably all know a lot of this, but this was a precinct that was developed after the subdivision of the jail. So it's a very interwar character, having been developed subsequent to the jail closing and being subdivided in the early 20th century. Park Road precinct is capturing that spine along Park Road opposite the park. And I just wanted to clarify for those, it might have been a question that some people have raised, is why the park isn't in the overlay. It's because the park itself is actually on the Victorian Heritage Register. So it's given that level of protection at the state level already. And so including it within the heritage overlay actually doesn't add it to its management in any particular way, because you already have that state level management that supersedes council when it comes to the management of heritage values. And we thought that not including it in the precinct curtilage, you can still acknowledge the importance of the park in the development of that, the historic spine, and in the development of the particular character that exists along Park Road. But actually including the park itself in the curtilage didn't add to an understanding of the values of the residential precinct that sits alongside it. The Western Residential Precinct is quite a large precinct that sits kind of southwest. Some of these directionals are a bit, yeah, we did the best we could with the naming, but this is capturing a significant section of the town kind of to the west and south of Barclay Gardens in particular. That's not the right name. Village Gardens. That Barclay Gardens are in Richmond. Sorry, everyone. I'm thinking Barclay Street. I've got the wrong names in my head. But you can see that originally HO 206 did kind of extend up to some streets around here, so up to High Street and Derby Road, and we kind of made in response to the fieldwork that we undertaken, kind of pulled some of that back and created this Western Residential Precinct that wasn't in the 2005 report in this format. So we did quite a lot of change around here to make sure that this part of town was captured and protected, and the values that exist here were also continued to be protected going into the future. Palmerston Street Precinct was originally kind of, as in the 2005 study, really centred along Palmerston Street. Similarly to the Western Residential Precinct, we've expanded up to the north, particularly to capture the intact streetscapes in this area. There are some changes in the area around the existing curtilage, but the statements of significance are great, and that's kind of talk through how this, why this precinct is significant. I won't go through much detail on Raglan Street, but effectively, again, a residential precinct centred along Raglan Street. The Eastern Residential Precinct was another precinct that we picked up following a lot of community discussion with the Heritage Reference Group. It wasn't in the 2005 study, but there was nothing in this part of town that wasn't consistent with other parts of the precinct, and we did think that there were things there that needed to be retained in the heritage overlay and continue to be protected. They've got a significant residential precinct along this area. This is the industrial group listing, which is picking up some of those industrial sites down near the railway and also the tower of the knitting mills. Specifically, this is the list of individual places that we're looking at protecting. They're in the documents. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but again, happy to answer specific questions on any of these. I just got the last few things is to talk about the exemptions and the guidelines and a little bit on next steps. So what the exemptions are doing is really, it's a management tool. So it's providing a series of minor works that can be undertaken to your property without requiring a planning permit. So effectively, this would be a document that allows you to undertake a minor modification, potentially to the rear of your property, introduce new doors or windows or a rear addition, repave things, do landscaping, do undertake repairs, those kind of things. The exemptions, it's a document that will sit in the planning scheme. It will sit alongside those citations, and it will give you guidance, but also give council planners guidance on what you need a planning permit for. So it will hopefully ease the burden on the statutory department, planning department at council, by not requiring a permit for every little piece of work that you need to do to your heritage house. It will kind of clear the way for a lot of those simpler works or minor works that you need to do at your property, and then leave those permit considerations for those more significant changes that do need to go through that process, and the ability for neighbours and community members to be notified and go through that process of advertising through a planning process. And then the Central Goldfields design guidelines are really to provide guidance to applicants and to the planning team at council around what is the kind of best practice approach to managing heritage places. So that could be maintenance, restoration, but also additions. What do they need to look like? What do changes need to look like to be responsive and sensitive to the heritage values of the place? They're high level. They're meant to apply pretty broadly across heritage overlays throughout Central Goldfields Shire, but they do provide, I think, that level of guidance. They're in the volume 3 of the document if you wanted to have a look. So as I said, next steps is really for this consultation to take place, for your comments to feed back in through council to extent, for us to make kind of final updates to the documentation before it is sent to council for adoption, and council need to consider that. If council do adopt, it would then become what's called a planning scheme amendment. That's a formal process. At that point in time, it gets exhibited again. Any submissions to that exhibition are considered by Planning Panels Victoria, who are an independent statutory body that is independent from council, independent from extent, and they take into account, make a series of recommendations around the study documentation in consideration of those submissions. Once that process is complete, it would probably come back to extent for us to also consider the recommendations of the planning panel. And then the final step of that is, once all of that's been done, once we've updated documentation, council planners are happy with it, it would go back up to council again for them to adopt the final version of the study, and that becomes the gazetted planning scheme. So at the moment, nothing actually changes on a day-to-day basis right now. It still has to go through all of this before you actually see the changes in the day-to-day application of the heritage overlay and the planning scheme. As I said, I'm upstairs afterwards. You can come talk to me directly, but I hope that was helpful for everyone. And I'll hand back to Philip, and I know Jeff wanted to say something as well.
Comments from Jeff, and then I'll wrap up before we go into the second part of the evening.
I think I hadn't intended to do this, but no, I don't like microphones. I hadn't intended to do this, but I think it's important to point out, with the community consultation group and the planners and extent, there has been some very robust discussions at time. I noticed, and I'll try to remember them, Michael and Helen Ritchie are here, and they might have noticed on the new civic precinct, their house is not included. So it's outside the boundary. But then when you look at the Palmerston Street precinct, their house is included. So that's the change from HO 206. one of the most important changes, or one of the most important effects, was under HO 206, basically the heritage overlay went from Inkerman Street to Peel Street. Under the new suggested precinct, which is the old jail precinct, it stops at Peel Street. But it stops on the south side of Peel Street. So possibly the most important social house in Maryborough, Sir Edmund's Herring House, that was previously covered, is now not covered because it's outside the suggested precinct. But then if you notice on the individual citations, the community reference group says Sir Edmund Tiverton has to be included, so it has its own individual citation. I would have liked to have seen the Brigadine Convent, which is now Highview, included. But coming back, it was outside HO 206, so we couldn't include it. And finally, there are two arms of the main drain, being the main lead and Blackman's lead. The reason Blackman's lead doesn't appear in essence is because it's outside the scope of ours. But Neil, I can assure you that the main drain in the narrative, both arms, will be well documented. So that's how the new changes have made. And probably the best example, as I say, is Tiverton. Was covered, has to be covered, is not covered under the new scheme, so individual citation. And I have to say, in discussion, if you've got buildings that you think should be included, please make people aware of them.
Councillor Lovett, that pretty much winds up the first part of the evening. You've been sitting for quite a long time and probably many of you have questions, but as I said at the beginning, I think the best way to manage questions is to break into smaller groups on particular areas and one-on-one chats with people who are here who can help. So Michelle will be up there, and particularly on some of the technical questions of how do you decide what's in and what's out, what sort of meets the criteria. Michelle's available for those sort of questions. Raju and I and Peter, I might get Peter just to step in. Peter's our manager of statutory services, so it's his team that handles all the permits applications when they come in. So I saw his face light up when we were talking about things like guidelines and exemptions now that are those extra tools that help you as property owners and us as council make decisions and actually improve the whole process and improve everybody's understanding of what should be protected, what shouldn't, and what you can and can't do on your own property. So we'll be up there to answer questions where we can, or to take notes for things for further feedback if we can't answer them straight away. And the other thing I'll reinforce is in terms of you then giving feedback to us once you've got your clarity about it and good understanding of how it might affect you and what you like, what you don't like. There's feedback now open for the next couple of weeks on this study and this documentation that's, as I said, available online or in hard copy, council front desk or the library. You can put in something in writing, either written form or online feedback via council's Engage website. If you just go to the website, you see the directions to that page. All the information is also on council's website for this project. And there will be subsequent stages where you can have some feedback as well. So that will be when there's a planning scheme amendment out on exhibition, and ultimately if you want to be heard by a planning panel to give feedback if you're still sort of not in complete agreement with what's being proposed. So it's a very rigorous process. It can seem really laborious in some ways, all these steps and all this time, but that's to make sure we're doing things properly and they stand up to scrutiny at panels and VCAT and court cases and things like that. They have to be really thorough, and we have to be really clear that people such as yourselves have had your chance to be heard. So this is part of a multi-step process. So I'll wind up here for now. You can go if you want, if you feel like you've got enough information to go away with. You can grab a biscuit and a cuppa before you go, or you can grab it now and then come upstairs. As I said, there's a lift there if you need it, and we will have sort of smaller group conversations up there, and you can stay for 5 minutes or stay for an hour. We'll be here for up till 7 o'clock, and happy to take any questions you've got there. So over to you, and you find your way up there, and you can see the different tables with different maps and places.